The committee will now come to order. There's been a significant question raised in the past year or so whether or not the president has enough power to fix the problems at the border. And that's what this hearing will be about, is there enough statutory authority for the president to do things that need to be done at the border? Over the past 4 years, we have witnessed an unprecedented erosion of security at our borders. This deterioration was marked by a complete disregard for the laws that were put in place to protect U.S. citizens. Since the start of the Biden-Harris administration, nearly 11 million individuals have been encountered attempting to illegally enter the United States. In his first year in office, President Biden repealed over 80 of President Trump's policies that had effectively secured the southwest border. What was once a controlled and secure boundary quickly turned into a revolving door. These open-door policies allowed individuals, many with little to no documentation, to show up, state their name or a name, and waltz right into the country. The Biden-Harris administration claims they check everyone against criminal databases, but they only do so against U.S. and allied nations records, leaving massive blind spots for criminals from countries that don't share information or have reliable databases. Criminals and terrorist-linked individuals were able to slip into the country undetected, often disappearing without ever appearing at their court dates. Customs and Border Protection apprehended nearly 400 suspected terrorists attempting to illegally enter the ports of entry, another 1,500 at ports of entry. And these are just the ones that managed to get caught. Countless others have evaded detection. During these last few years, the laws that exist to protect this nation were bent, abused, and outright ignored. Parole, which is meant to be used sparingly, became a loophole, and asylum laws were distorted to justify an open border agenda. Tragically, Laken Riley was brutally murdered because the Biden administration paroled her killer. No other family should ever have to endure the pain hers has. President Biden discarded proven strategies like Remain in Mexico, which was undeniably successful in deterring illegal entries. The results were immediate and disastrous. During the last full month of Trump administration, when Remain in Mexico was in effect, border encounters were under 70,000. After its repeal, the number surged to over 100,000 and continued to rise. Remember this, under the Obama administration, their standard for what constituted a crisis was 1,000 attempted crossings in a day. Under the Biden-Harris administration, there have been on average over 6,000 encounters daily at the southwest border, yet they insisted there was no crisis. Their policies created a pull effect, enticing migrants to pay cartels thousands of dollars for a treacherous journey to the southwest border. The message over time, over the last 4 years, has been, if you show up, we'll find a way to get you in. And who has benefited from that? The cartels, who profit from this human pipeline, and terrorist-linked individuals exploiting the chaos to slip in unnoticed. All the powers needed to address this crisis, we believe, already exist under current law. The president has the authority to implement Remain in Mexico, and the Department of Homeland Security can immediately return migrants to a neighboring foreign country. The president also holds broad powers to suspend or restrict entry for any group deemed detrimental to our national interest. Section 208 of the Immigration Nationality Act says the president and the Secretary of Homeland Security may grant asylum, not shall grant asylum. Section 208 also allows President Trump to make anyone illegally entering the country ineligible for asylum. Additionally, under Section 212, President Trump can stop the entry of illegal aliens altogether. Finally, Section 235 authorizes him to immediately place illegal immigrants back onto the Mexican side of the border. The 2024 election was a clear mandate from the American people to reverse President Biden's disastrous open border policies. We must reinstate Remain in Mexico and use the other existing authorities to the full extent. That is why immediately following this hearing, we will vote on affirming the President's and the Secretary of Homeland Security's legal authority to secure the southwest border, including taking immediate steps to remove illegal aliens, reinstate Remain in Mexico, and end catch and release. The Trump administration demonstrated that when the law is enforced properly, it works. This resolution reaffirms that President Trump, or any president, has broad authority to resolve the ongoing crisis. I urge my colleagues to stand with us uphold the rule of law, and restore order at our nation's borders. This time I'll recognize the ranking member, Senator Peters.
Thank you, Chairman Fall. As a member of this committee, I have long made securing our borders a top priority. I've been pleased to work with members on both sides of the aisle to advance bipartisan, common sense legislation that strengthens border security and provides tools and resources to support our border security professionals as they carry out their extremely challenging missions. I look forward to working together to continuing these efforts in this Congress. I recognize that we face significant challenges at our southern border, and I'm committed to working in a bipartisan way to address those challenges. Today, we're discussing the policy known as Remain in Mexico, which was created during the first Trump administration and first implemented in 2019. Under this policy, certain migrants seeking asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border were processed and returned to Mexico to wait for their next immigration court hearings in the United States. Although billed as a means of deterring migrants, the policy's real success was dumping fuel into the fire of cartel activity in Mexico. This particular policy accelerated dangerous illegal activity led by cartels in Mexico even more. It is estimated that these cartels have raked in billions of dollars from this criminal activity through drug trafficking, extortion, human trafficking and smuggling, and ransom kidnappings of asylum seekers. After the implementation of the Remain in Mexico policy, a report documented more than 1,500 allegations of violent harm caused by cartels, including homicide, sexual assault, and kidnapping in just a couple years. There are also numerous reports of cartels extorting asylum seekers for thousands of dollars so they wouldn't be murdered by the cartels while they waited in Mexico for their scheduled immigration hearings, often over the course of several months. Although today we are discussing a policy and its impact in Mexico, we know that cartels bring their criminal activities across our borders and into our communities in the United States. We should implement policies that will we should not implement policies that will further enrich cartels and enable their violent criminal enterprise on either side of the border. We should be focused on policies that help frontline DHS personnel get ahead of these dangerous cartels. I'm committed to working in a bipartisan way to find common sense solutions that strengthen border security, streamline our immigration and asylum process, and ensure DHS personnel have the tools and the resources that they need to complete their national security mission. I appreciate our witnesses here today for sharing their testimony and for contributing to our discussion on securing our borders.
It's the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses. Will each of you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
From 2019 to 2021, Mr. Ken Cuccinelli served in the federal government, first as the acting director of United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and then as the acting deputy secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. During his tenure, he was a leading spokesman on immigration, Homeland Security, and election security, and was appointed by President Trump to serve as an original member of the Coronavirus Task Force. In addition to practicing law for over 25 years, Mr. Cuccinelli served in the Virginia Senate from 2002 to 2010 and as Virginia's Attorney General from 2010 to 2014. Mr. Cuccinelli, welcome to the committee. You are now recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the challenges and opportunities in dealing with illegal immigration as we look forward to the second swearing in of Donald Trump as President of the United States next Monday. The President of the United States does have vast authority to secure America's border, to determine who may enter and under what conditions they may enter. As one example, a president could reestablish the so-called Remain in Mexico program that did so much in the latter part of 2019 to drive down illegal alien efforts to even enter the United States. And I want to emphasize how important it is that the world knows a president is serious about keeping illegal aliens out. When someone somewhere in the world is contemplating spending large portions of their life savings to try and illegally enter the United States, they want to know that they have a good chance for success before giving away their money and taking that risky trip. The real success of programs like the Remain in Mexico program is not just that they screen out fake asylum seekers, but that they help deter illegal aliens from coming in the first place. The goal of true border security is to be so effective at keeping attempted illegal entrants out that they never try to come in the first place. In that vein, the fastest improvement that the new administration could make is at the border itself. The swearing in of Donald Trump to the presidency will instantly convert the 20,000 men and women of the Border Patrol from the world's largest group of greeters back into law enforcement officers whose goal is to actually defend the border instead of facilitating the ongoing invasion that the Biden administration has offered up. If they are supplemented immediately by military personnel and assets moved to the border who actually block illegal entrants instead of uselessly backing up the Border Patrol, then America's southern border could be effectively sealed to illegal alien traffic and most of the accompanying drug traffic between the legal ports of entry in a matter of weeks. It would be a historic accomplishment, and it is absolutely attainable. Literally, the only thing required is a president with the political will to do it, and I expect that such a president will be sworn in next week. Let me say that in a different way. The assets and authorities needed to completely secure our southern border between the legal ports of entry already exist, with no additional legislation or funding needed. That doesn't mean those things wouldn't help, but it is at least possible. But securing the southern border is only step one. Every pull factor should be eliminated at both the federal and state level. And I might add that given the fact that this government is so hopelessly bankrupt, a good place to start is to end every dollar of spending for immigrants of any kind. First the illegals, but also even legal immigrants. This Congress might as well begin to adjust to the day when severe cuts are necessary across the board. Best to start by cutting spending on non-Americans as soon as possible, given that such cuts are already overdue. Perhaps the single biggest pull factor is work permits. The administration can ensure that only properly vetted and qualified recipients ever receive work permits by regulation, which is the primary source of implementable authority in this area. Work permits need to be as severely restricted as the law allows, specifically to only those aliens who have already established their legal authority to be present in the United States, coupled with turning a majority of all HSI agents to workplace enforcement, with charges brought against American businesses using illegal aliens in lieu of American workers, in addition, of course, to identifying and deporting those here illegally. Reinstating third country asylum is critical to keeping the inflow of new cases down while the Trump administration works with Congress to build the capacity needed to finally catch up on the caseload of illegal aliens already present in the United States, a situation that is both dangerous and expensive. This involves expanded deportation capacity, for example, more immigration judges, prosecutors, and logistical support, as President Trump has laid out the largest domestic logistical undertaking of our lifetimes, that being the deportation of the vast majority of illegal aliens present in the United States. If the incoming administration makes significant progress on its deportation goals, likely only with the cooperation and assistance of Congress, then America will reap the benefits in greater security, lower crime, more job opportunities for poor Americans, higher wages for poor Americans, as we saw in 2019, and more predictable and manageable budgets for state and local governments that are so severely affected by the invasion of illegal aliens that America has suffered for so many years. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We also will welcome Andrew Arthur to our committee today. Mr. Arthur is the resident fellow in law and policy at the Center for Immigration Studies. Prior to joining the center in April 2017, he served as the staff director for the National Security Subcommittee at the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Oversight and Government and Reform. That's a mouthful. Mr. Arthur previously served as an immigration judge at the York Immigration Court in York, Pennsylvania, where he heard thousands of deportation, removal, and bond cases cases and considered applications for asylum and other forms of immigration-related relief. He has testified before Congress on 13 occasions and has been quoted in numerous publications. Mr. Arthur, welcome to the committee. You are now recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Paul, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the Migrant Protection Protocols, better known as Remain in Mexico, also known as MPP. MPP was implemented in response to an unprecedented surge in third country nationals and adults with children and family units entering illegally across the southwest border. Of the more than 153,000 migrants caught crossing the border in the first 3 months of FY 2019, nearly half, just over 49%, were in family units. That's an issue for a number of reasons, the most prominent being that, as a bipartisan panel revealed in April 2019, the children in those family units are traumatized and exposed to unconscionable risks during the illegal journey here. That panel also highlighted, quote, reports that female parents of minor children have been raped, that many migrants are robbed, and that they and their children are held hostage and extorted for money. Things became so bad in March of 2019 that then DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen declared a border emergency. She explained the system was in free fall as her department scrambled to care for families in which migrant children were, quote, arriving sicker than ever before, close quote, after being, quote, exploited along the treacherous trek to the United States, close quote. It was against this backdrop that the Trump administration first implemented Remain in Mexico. Using authority in Section 235B2C of the INA, Immigration Nationality Act, DHS returned migrants back across the border to await expedited asylum hearings at designated port courts. Those whose claims were granted were admitted, while migrants whose claims were denied were quickly removed. After a phased-in implementation and legal challenges, MPP was up and running by October 2019 when DHS issued its assessment of the program. DHS concluded that MPP was, quote, an indispensable tool in addressing the ongoing crisis at the southern border and restoring integrity to the immigration system, close quote. Border encounters dropped by 64% between May and September of 2019, and encounters with, quote, Central American families who were the main driver of the crisis decreased by approximately 80%, close quote, according to that assessment. Remain in Mexico was implemented with the consent and assistance of the government of Mexico. Returnees received access to humanitarian care and assistance, food and housing, work permits, and education in Mexico. Our State Department funded a $5.5 million project in September 2019 to provide housing in Mexican border cities to approximately 8,000 vulnerable third country asylum seekers and others, as well as $11.9 million in cash-based assistance to migrants to move out of shelters while they were in MPP. The Biden administration suspended and then twice ended MPP, and the impacts of those decisions are being felt throughout U.S. cities and towns to this day. Congress has given DHS 3 deterrents it can use to curb illegal migration to this country. 1, barriers and other infrastructure. 2, criminal prosecution for improper entry under Section 275 of the INA. And 3, detention, which is mandated by statute under Section 235B of the INA for illegal entrants and other inadmissible aliens. Under a 2015 district court decision, however, DHS can't detain children and family units for more than 20 days, and separating families has proven unacceptable. Consequently, adult migrants and smugglers use those children as pawns in an effort to enter and remain here indefinitely. In addition, a recent settlement agreement entered into by the Biden administration bars DHS from prosecuting adults and family units for improper entry with only limited exceptions. Children are a stay out of jail free card. And while barriers impede illegal entry, they can't prevent it. Remain in Mexico under Section 235B2C of the INA is a potential 4th deterrent because it discourages illegal entrants from gaming our humanitarian protections by making bogus or weak asylum claims solely to be released to live and work in the United States for years while their claims are being considered. Asylum claims were expedited under MPP and decisions issued more quickly. Those meriting asylums could thus begin their new lives sooner than if they'd been released. Critics have argued MPP returnees were subject to threats and predation while awaiting their hearings. In terminating MPP in October 2021, DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas admitted it was, quote, possible that such humanitarian challenges could be lessened through the expenditure of significant government resources, close quote. Respectfully, the migrant crisis over the past 4 years has already cost taxpayers tens to hundreds of billions of dollars, including at the state and local level, where officials have no say over immigration decisions made in Washington. If this is simply a question of money, my question to you is, what price do you put on border security? Thank you again. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. We're also pleased to welcome Adam Isacson to our committee. Mr. Isacson has worked on defense security and peace building in Latin America since 1994. He now directs the Washington Office on Latin America program on defense there, and which monitors security trends in Americas, including U.S. cooperation with security forces. Since 2011, Mr. Isacson has also focused on border security. He's visited the U.S.-Mexico border over 30 times and has also completed field research along nearly the entire border between Mexico and Guatemala and countries further south, also along the U.S.-bound migration route. Before coming to WOLA in 2010, Mr. Isacson worked on Latin America demilitarization at the Center for International Policy. Mr. Isacson, welcome to the committee. You are now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Paul. Thank you, Ranking Member Peters. It's good to meet both of you. Thank you, members of the committee. It's great to be here with you today. Now, I did do a lot of field work and data work along the U.S.-Mexico border when Remain in Mexico, MPP, was first implemented. The evidence I saw was clear. Remain in Mexico enriched the cartels. It failed to meaningfully deter migration, and it soured relations with a key ally. Pursuing it again would harm U.S. interests. Instead, I urge the committee to focus on fixing our asylum system, which I agree is broken. That system does save tens of thousands of lives every year, but we need it to be both fair and efficient. No one supports the idea of 5-year waits for asylum decisions. The backlogs do create a pull factor of their own, but this is an administrative challenge, and the U.S. government is good at administrative challenges. It's a question of processing, case management, adjudication, all of which are lacking. People truly did suffer while remaining in Mexico. I personally heard harrowing accounts of torture and abuse. Nearly all of that abuse was the work of organized crime groups, the cartels. The cartels' cruelty, their sadism, it wasn't just a human rights issue, though. The criminals aren't barbaric just for its own sake. This is their economic model, and that makes it a national security issue. Organized crime is trying to extract as much money out of migrants and their loved ones as it can while those migrants are present on the turf that they control. Cartels fight each other for this business. Remain in Mexico kept migrants on cartels' turf for very long periods of time, months or even years in Mexican border cities, waiting for their hearings. MPP created a new market opportunity for cartels. That's a big difference from CBP-1. The app also requires months-long waits to come to a U.S. port of entry, but it makes it easier to wait elsewhere in Mexico, in parts of Mexico that are safer than the northern border zone, where states are under State Department travel warnings because of cartel crime and kidnapping. When outsiders are waiting for months in Mexico's border zone, on the other hand, they're sitting ducks for the cartels. First, there's extortion. Foreigners have to pay just to exist for a long time in cartel-dominated neighborhoods. If you don't pay, it's not safe to go outside your shelter, even if the United States is helping support it. Second, if people wanted to just give up on this long wait for MPP, the cartels were there offering coyote services, the chance to cross the border and try to evade Border Patrol for thousands of dollars. Third was kidnapping for ransom. Cartels held people in horrific conditions, raping, torturing them, as their relatives, frequently in the United States, had to wire thousands of dollars to get them free. The financial scale of that exploitation was staggering. Let's just consider it. Imagine that each person in MPP, on average, had to pay about $1,000 in cartel fees. I ran this number by a few folks I've worked with at the border, and they laughed at how low that estimate was. But if it's right, 71,000 people in the MPP program times $1,000, that's $71 million that cartels made in addition to what they were already making as a result of MPP. That's an amount that you could use to pay the base salaries of 1,000 Border Patrol agents. For all that, Remain in Mexico really didn't do that much to reduce or control migration. For more than 10 years now, there's been a series of crackdowns on asylum seekers. My testimony maps them out in a graphic that looks like this if you look at the written testimony. These crackdowns follow the same pattern. You get an initial drop in migration, then it lasts a few months, and then there's a rebound. Classic example was Title 42 and all of its expansions. We saw migration increase even though there was no asylum access at the border. After it expanded in June 2019, Border Patrol's apprehensions did fall for 4 months. They fell steeply. Then the migration numbers plateaued at the same level they were in mid-2018, at the same level they were on average for all 8 years of Barack Obama's administration. And that's where the numbers stayed. And then in the first months of 2020, Border Patrol apprehensions started rising slowly. Maybe not even slowly. They were on pace to grow by double-digit percentage margins in March of 2020, but then COVID came, and that all but ended that month 10 days early. So we never really could tell. Title 42 ended up eclipsing Remain in Mexico. No more hearing dates for anybody. Asylum seekers just got expelled. Remain in Mexico basically became irrelevant for the last 10 months of Donald Trump's administration. We're talking about a few dozen people a month by the end. MPP also strained relations with Mexico. The Mexican government at first resisted the program, agreeing to it only after very heavy diplomatic pressure. This complicated cooperation on other shared priorities, and there are a lot of shared priorities in our relationship with Mexico, from trade to fentanyl. Mexico is one of the 10 largest countries in the world in population, number 14 economy in the world. Even if we didn't have this 2,000-mile border, there'd be a whole host of interests that we don't want to spend too much bandwidth on trying to get them to agree on one program, a program that actually strengthens drug cartels and actually doesn't have that much of an effect on migration. So thank you. I really look forward to your questions in the discussion, and I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you all for your testimony. I'm going to defer my questions for now and recognize Ranking Member Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first ask, Mr. Chairman, I ask for a unanimous consent to submit 20+ statements for the record from a wide range of organizations against the reinstatement of this program, including from the Nonpartisan American Immigration Council, Church World Services, and the International Refugee Assistance Project.
Without objection.
Mr. Isacson, can you start by telling us who actually benefited the most from the Remain in Mexico policy?
So the biggest financial benefit definitely went to the cartels, who suddenly had this large base of people they could extort.
So could you walk us through what it looked like when an asylum seeker was returned to Mexico under the Remain in Mexico policy?
It's pretty vivid. And actually, even if you or I were to walk across the port of entry into a town like Matamoros or Reynosa, you would see cartel spies everywhere. You would see people, a nice man in a suit just standing there. He's looking to see who's crossing. The guy selling tamales on the bridge, he's looking to see who's crossing. Now imagine you're somebody who is maybe wearing DHS-issued sweatpants and maybe a bag that says DHS on it, or shoes with no shoelaces on them. You are immediately seen as somebody who is ripe to be kidnapped. It's widely known that the first half hour after being returned to Mexico from MPP, always at the same exit, usually roughly at the same time of day, was a very dangerous time for you. And then you would be in a shelter, sometimes U.S. funded, sometimes a government-run shelter, sometimes charity run, and it was pretty clear that you could not leave unless you had made an extortion payment to the hotel, to the cartels.
Mm-hmm. So how does this type of activity that you've just described, taking place right across from the border, how does that impact our national security?
By enriching the cartels and giving them a new income stream, it strongly impacts our national security. We do not want transnational organized crime to be wealthier, that close to our borderline. And in the recent years, even since, as we've had higher numbers of migrants coming, it's become bigger and bigger business for the cartels. And instead of mom and pop smugglers, we now have Sinaloa and Jalisco and La Linea and other major national cartels in Mexico running the business and fighting each other for it. And that just makes it more dangerous for the United States.
Yeah, and the money that cartels are raising here, getting enriched because of this policy, they use to basically increase their other operations, like sending fentanyl across the border to poison our kids and our people.
Yeah, it costs only about $60,000 to set up a fentanyl lab. So what they're making from that extortion money could be reinvested in that.
Actually helps their drug trafficking in the United States.
It's all fungible.
So, Mr. Isacson, can Remain in Mexico policy even be re-implemented without the cooperation of the government of Mexico?
I mean, it involves sending people to Mexico's sovereign territory, so I don't know how you could send people back without Mexico eventually noticing that you're doing that.
That's for sure. So we know the cartels have long made money off of the smuggling routes to the United States, but how did cartels exploit the Remain in Mexico policy to threaten them? You've talked a little bit about that, but maybe elaborate more.
How did they use the policy to threaten people? They knew that people had a date by which they had to get back to the port of entry. They had an appointment. They had to be there. And boy, does that make them motivated to pay more, to have to call more of their relatives and get that ransom money wired, which of course is a crime that involves U.S. soil, somebody on U.S. soil having to wire the money. It made them more motivated and raised the prices that they could charge.
Mm-hmm. So we've seen changes in migration patterns worldwide recently, and during the initial implementation of Remain in Mexico, my understanding is that a significant portion of migrants encountered were from Mexico or Central America.
Right.
How would today's migration flows, because we live in a different world today, how would that impact Mexico's ability to accommodate a new Remain in Mexico?
Yeah, as late as 2020, 90% of your migrants were from 4 countries, Mexico and the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America. Now that's only 52% of the total. You've got a United Nations of people coming here. Last year, 1 in 9 were not even from this hemisphere. And that's because new routes have opened up, like the Darien Gap or Nicaragua, and that does mean you have a lot more nationalities that Mexico might be required to accept. Is Mexico going to take Chinese people, Indians, Bangladeshis, or even people from Brazil or Haiti who don't really speak Spanish? That would be a huge issue to have to negotiate with the Mexicans.
So my last question, my remaining time here, Ms. Isacson, what policies, because we want to address border security. It's absolutely essential that we do that. So what do you believe the U.S. can implement, along with our other partners, to proactively address these worldwide migration trends that have changed dramatically over the last few years?
Well, imagine we had an asylum system that could hand out decisions in a matter of months with full due process and fairly, but had that capacity. You'd have a lot fewer people trying to attempt to enter that system if they knew that the decision would be turned around that way. You're not sitting here 5 years with a work permit and able to decide. Imagine you had a program like CBP-1 that actually made a lot of these entries and waits in Mexico. It's not a perfect program, but it did make it more orderly. That would free up a lot more Border Patrol agents to be on the line instead of having to do this processing.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think by now most people have seen this chart. It's become a lot more famous from when I started developing this as chairman of this committee back in 2015, different versions of it. This chart I gave to President Trump in April of 2024 that he liked, adopted, started using the campaign, and on July 13th, turned his head and saved his life. But so that's obviously the biggest benefit, the most important benefit of this chart. But prior to that, what I like most about this chart is it showed cause and effect. It showed the effect of different policies, different court decisions like the reinterpretation of the Flores decision. But in particular, it showed how effective the migrant protection program was, Return to Mexico. And it's obvious. And Mr. Isacson and Senator Peters, I can't believe that you're sitting here telling us that MPP, that Remain in Mexico, didn't work. It obviously worked. This was a crisis for the Trump administration. By the way, crisis caused by deferred action on childhood arrivals. That's the catalyst that sparked all these crises since that was implemented in June 2012. So when President Trump faced his immigration crisis, he did something about it. He used the existing law. And it was a lie over the last 4 years that President Biden didn't have the executive authority to secure the border. He had it. He used that exact executive authority to open the border back up and cause this clear and present danger to America. Mr. Isacson, you're talking about we're fueling, or I think this is actually ranking member, so we're dumping fuel in the fire of the cartels. I mean, at this point, I think it's 570 encounters a day. I think the record was over 14,000 December 2000, whenever it was, 2023. When you have those migrants paying $5,000, $7,000, $10,000, $15,000 to the cartel, I mean, do the math. 10,000 times versus $1,000 for the thousands that were in migrant protection. So we were protecting people by deterring them from trying to come to this country illegally. There's no doubt about it. And the cost we have, I think, the House subcommittee on this is determine the cost of taking care of this massive flow of illegal immigration is $150 billion a year. And again, have you not heard of the taunting trees, the panty trees, the rape trees during this time of the cartels just basically taunting CBP by putting the undergarments of the young girls that they rape, but they're also getting $5,000, $7,000, $10,000 for the trafficking. So there's absolutely no doubt the return or remain in Mexico problem worked. The president has the authority to do so, to implement this and implement it again. I think it is important to note that one of the keys was the threat of tariffs against Mexico. We needed Mexico's cooperation here. You know, we implemented MPP, I think, in the summer of 2019, and we still saw numbers rise until President Trump called up the president of Mexico and said, we need your cooperation. You're going to get hit with tariffs, and you see the dramatic result. So, Mr. Cinelli, can you just talk again about what authority exists? To talk about really what a lie we've been told over the last 4 years that President Biden didn't have the authority. He obviously did. He used the same authority to open up the border and cause this catastrophe.
Yeah, he absolutely did. And the cartels have never been so flush with cash because of that open borders policy. I would point out, we look at the border from the north. And if you think about Mexico, in the northern part of Mexico, but not just the northern part of Mexico, the federal government of Mexico doesn't control Mexico. 1/6 of the country is controlled by the cartels. 1/6 is contested between the cartels and the government. And, you know, Mr. Isacson says, you know, within 30 minutes of leaving MPP, the same thing happens over and over. Well, that can't happen if Mexico is actually policing the border, which they're not, and they're not able to do. So I would also add that a lot of the violence that occurred both between Mexicans and directed at illegal migrants in Mexico by the cartels over the years has been fairly widely reported in Mexico. There are reasons it isn't the cartels go after those journalists, but we don't see any of that reporting here. None of it. And it's brutal, it is vicious, and it has been fueled by the explosion in traffic in the last 4 years. The president has the tools to turn that traffic off. We saw, as you noted on the chart, that you can have an effect on the direction of the traffic and meaning the numbers. And I fully expect President Trump will do that. Remain in Mexico is just one tool. There are other tools as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I agree there are other tools. And in 2013, we passed in the United States Senate a comprehensive immigration reform that, in fact, would have implemented those other tools toward securing our border. I continue to support more robust efforts at border security. I think that view is shared by most, if not all of us, here in the United States Senate. And I'm still hopeful that we can do another comprehensive border security and immigration reform that addresses all of the facets of our broken immigration system. And I'm hoping that President Trump, once he is sworn in, will pursue that objective, and he'll find, I think, very favorable responses on both sides of the aisle here in the United States Congress. I am, as a former prosecutor, and Mr. Cinelli shares part of my background as a state attorney general, focused on how we actually deal with the nuts and bolts of these cartels. And I think all three of you have extensive experience in this area. Could the Mexican government, in cooperation with our law enforcement, be doing more to counter these cartels under the authority, and I agree the president has the authority to do more, and how would those resources be focused? Specifically, how can we secure more cooperation from the government of Mexico. Let me go down the line, and I'm going to stop talking so that I give each of you maximum amount of time.
Yes, Senator, this is an area where Congress could be quite helpful. You know, one of the things that's thrown out all the time is declaring the cartels terrorist organizations, foreign terrorist organizations. If you look at the statutes that address foreign terrorist organizations, they come with very sweeping connections to the rest of the community. That statute was designed with isolated cells of Islamists in mind. The cartels are integrated into the communities. They take advantage of the communities they live in. They make money off them. And we need a different statute. It would be very helpful if Congress formulated a much more surgical approach to dealing with something like the cartels that use terrorist tactics for organized crime goals. And they are quasi-governments because they control territory in Mexico that the Mexican government simply won't contest. This government won't, the last administration would not. And granted, that is a significant challenge. So that's an area where this Congress could be quite helpful, is in providing more of those tools specifically to go after the cartels. And I would, you know, people think in terms of kinetic action, but they're about money. When you boil it down, they're about money. And any legislation along those lines should include the ability of the Treasury Department to seek out and seize their assets around the world.
Thank you. Mr. Arthur.
Senator, I wholeheartedly agree with Attorney General Cuccinelli. It's important to note the fact, you know, we talk about the impacts the cartels have on the United States. It's deleterious, it's horrible with the fentanyl. They have an equally deleterious, corrosive effect in Mexico. Mexico has been waging a drug war now since the early 2000s. Mr. Isacson could tell you all about that. 37,000 people dead. And the problem is that when Mexico cuts off the head of the cartel, it just gets worse because the people that come up underneath are even worse. We need to work very closely with them. Ken is right. Money is the lifeblood that fuels the cartels. We need to have drug reduction in the United States. I don't think Americans understand. Women get raped in Mexico because they use drugs in the United States. If they knew that, that would be I think that would be a game changer. But yes, I wholeheartedly agree with Ms. Cuccinelli. We need to have additional authorities go after them, seize the money, cut off the head, and help the Mexican government help themselves.
Mr. Isacson.
They're going to hear a lot of consensus here. You really can't talk about, I would add the element of corruption, though, even though it might make the Mexican government uncomfortable to talk about it. An organized crime group is not an insurgency. These aren't leftist guerrillas. This isn't ISIS. If you pound them harder, you haven't weakened them. You haven't gained control over that territory. Rather, they're harder to fight than an insurgency because they depend on their relationship with corrupt elements in the Mexican government. Mexican security chief for 6 years is now in jail in the United States for having worked with the Sinaloa cartel. We have to know who we're working with, and if you can't depend on your partner to actually help disarticulate those organized crime groups, you've got to take that oxygen away from them.
Well, I thank all three of you for
Could I offer one more thought, just very short, that it should be a strategic goal of the United States to help the Mexican government get control of 100% of Mexico, just to put it in very strategic national level terms.
I think these thoughts are really excellent. My time has expired, but I would like to pursue the suggestion that seems to unite all of you that we need to develop the tools, the law enforcement tools, to treat these cartels as terrorist organizations. Their ideology is simply dollars and cents. It isn't about converting the world to another religion or another political system. It is about money for them. And I think they need to be treated as terrorist organizations, even if they're of a different brand. So thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you to all of you for the work that you do on this. To go back to the dollars and cents of what Senator Blumenthal was talking about, in 2022, I was at the Rio Grande Valley and asked some of the Border Patrol folks there, how much do the cartels make just trafficking people in this region? Just this region, which is that section of the border, how much they make just trafficking people? And the response was, we estimate $153 million a week that they make trafficking people. The open border policy that happened in the last 4 years has facilitated incredible financial gain for the cartels. When they were making $153 million a week, moving people through at the highest numbers they possibly could, that facilitated this. In addition to that, other criminal organizations around the world saw how much money the cartels were making, and they wanted a piece of the travel agent money. And we started getting ISIS individuals coming in from Tajikistan because they were being facilitated in by criminal organizations coming in because it was easy to move. So this is incredibly important to be able to shut the money down. I do agree with Senator Blumenthal on that, and it's incredibly important that we actually use the authority that's already there to be able to get this done. Mr. Cuccinelli, thanks again for all the work that you've done on this for so long on this. You were very outspoken on H.R. 2, which is a great bill, very thorough on that, and you were very forward to say Congress needs to pass this bill. What are the aspects of that that you would say that still need to be done?
Well, you know, the chairman started with the president's authority to close the border, which I agree he has now. But H.R. 2 really starts to get at the longer term enforcement arc, processing of folks and keeping them out, closing loopholes that even if you close the border between the legal ports of entry, people will still come to the ports of entry, and there'll be I'll call it a bit of a negotiation, a bit of a game there about who can get in and who cannot. In the last 4 years, everybody's gotten in. And you really need to give your OFO officers in those ports of entry the legal tools to turn people away, anyone away who cannot demonstrate a then current basis to be in the country. Right. And H.R. 2 really advanced that. As you know, Senator, this whole area of law has been tangled up in knots with court rulings. We've heard
it's a mess. Yeah, we were talking before. Yeah, we were talking before, Mr. Arthur, about the Flores settlement.
Flores is a major one.
That's an issue that has to be settled in law. Yes. We have to be able to go engage in Congress to say what's this going to be, because the court just literally created the 20-day time period, and now we're stuck with it because Congress has not been able to respond. Mr. Arthur,
Senator, if I could add to that, there was a truly bipartisan report that was issued in April of 2019 by the CBP Families and Children Care Panel. Leon Fresco, who was Barack Obama's guy at DOJ, was on that panel. And they talked about all of these issues. And they they suggested solutions, including processing and detention centers down at the border. But they also called on Congress to fix Flores. Congress has the ability to fix it. And again, when there's a bipartisan recommendation like that, it's almost incumbent on Congress to at least give it a look, because this is a huge problem. The kids are suffering. I mean, everything that you've heard today is caused by that.
Yeah, it is. So I look at things like Safe Third Country as an area, trying to be able to get clarity there, ending the parole abuse, which we don't have a clear definition of humanitarian parole. We've got to be able to make that very, very clear. Dealing with a Title 42-like authority for emergency moments, to say when the cartels hold a bunch of folks and they rush a border patrol station or an area at that point, what to be able to do on that. TVPRA, Flores, all these different areas. These are areas that Congress has got to be able to act on and provide clarity, because courts are going to define it in different ways, and the rules are even different in Texas than what they are in California or in Arizona based on different court actions. And so we've got to be able to have some clarity on this, and that's an area where Congress has got to be able to act. So saying all that, the other issue that was brought up before was about what are called special interest aliens. These are folks that are coming in from Tajikistan and other areas that the Mexicans are not going to take back. These are recalcitrant countries that are not accepting folks back. We've got to have some sort of legal response, but we also have the authority of the administration to be able to put State Department pressure on some of these countries as well. But this is an area that we've got to be able to clarify in law on the recalcitrant country. Any comments from any of you specifically about those individuals? Mr. Arthur.
Senator Langford, when I was the chief of the National Security Law Division at INS, I worked for Janet Reno. Whenever we picked up a special interest alien at the border, Ms. Reno would call me day and night. I got a lot of calls from the command center in the middle of the night. Today, those individuals are being released into the United States, are being processed by line border patrol agents. This is a completely ridiculous situation. We've heard FBI Director Chris Wray talk about every light is blinking. We are in a situation, I served at the INS before September 11th. We are in a situation right now that is so much worse than what we were looking at.
We had 70,000 people that were special interest aliens that came in last year that we know of at this point from DHS records. And FBI told me point blank, because Chris Ray sat right there and I asked him, he told us point blank that he is not aware of all the SIAs that are coming in. The DHS was not informing him of those individuals. So we are not tracking those once they're in the country. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Senator Kim.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the three of you for coming on out here. I'm Senator Andy Kim from New Jersey. When I've gone around New Jersey and talked to a wide array of people in terms of some of our objectives, what are we trying to achieve when it comes to a border, when it comes to immigration, a couple of things came up over and over again. Number one, about making sure that we can provide security for our nation, keeping our communities safe, our families safe. Two, addressing the migrant backlog, just the amount of pressure that we're feeling in different towns, communities, cities all over the country. And three, about how do we try to have an orderly process. I think everyone is in agreement. We are a sovereign nation. We should have control over our sovereign borders, whether air, land, or sea. And so, you know, I try to approach this in that kind of lens, and I appreciate your thoughts on other types of categories to kind of think through. But, you know, Mr. Isacson, I think I'd like to start with you. You know, when it comes to the security, I mean, I think you made a compelling argument about some of the challenges faced by the cartels. But as Mr. Cinelli, Mr. Arthur, and others have also articulated, we continue to face these challenges with cartels now. It wasn't just unique to that moment where Remain in Mexico is in place. So I guess I wanted to just ask you, in particular, when it came to the Remain in Mexico period, how did that affect our security specifically? I heard a lot about the atrocious behaviors and how it affected those that were waiting, but was there a particular effect on us there, or is it just cumulative? I mean, we are experiencing a lot of that problems right now from cartels. Was there something unique about that moment that Remain in Mexico empowered the cartels to be able to achieve?
I'd say both during the Remain in Mexico period and also since, when you've seen this larger surge of migration under in the Biden years, you've seen cartels get wealthier. You've seen them consolidate. You've seen, rather than smugglers just paying a fee for the right to be in a territory, the cartels themselves were taking over that territory, which made them more wealthy. How does that affect us in the United States? Really, it's more indirect. Having wealthier cartels who can reinvest in more criminal activity that ultimately crosses the border affects us. We have not seen what you would call spillover violence or cartels actually carrying out their hits or their kidnappings very much on the U.S. side. I think the same way they wouldn't do that in a wealthy neighborhood of Mexico City because they want to live there, they don't do anything on the U.S. side that would, they have their kids going to school here, et cetera. They also don't want to do anything that would trigger a border closure. So you don't always feel it in day-to-day life on the U.S. side, but you do feel it indirectly.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. I mean, I don't want to linger too much on it because I think you've answered this, but I think, again, there's wide agreement across bipartisan about wanting to go after the cartels, making sure we have that security. You know, Mr. Isacson, Mr. Cinelli, you both raised something in your remarks, you know, talking about that orderly process, addressing that migrant backlog, you know, more than one ways we can do that. And Remain in Mexico tried to get at from one angle, but one thing that kind of seemed to stretch across is that need for some type of orderly process, whether increase in judges or other aspects of that try to shorten that timetable, shorten the window so that we can try to adjudicate this, and that'll help bring down the backlog. So I guess I just wanted to ask each of you, you know, just is that an area that we can find agreement on? Is that a place where we can drill in on as a committee to be able to try to address this? Why don't we start Mr. Isacson and make our way down?
I hope so. I mean, Section 208 of the INA says that if you are on U.S. soil and you fear for your life if you're returned, you do have the right to ask for asylum and get due process. Now, whether you're going to do that harshly or whether you're going to do that gently, right now you've only got 700 judges and 700 asylum officers, more or less, to do that entire backlog. And that we need more capacity. We have to.
Is everyone in agreement we need more than 700, Mr. Arthur?
Yeah, having been an immigration judge myself, I read a very, very busy docket. My wife didn't see me much, neither did my son. But the important thing to keep in mind, Senator Kim, when you're talking about this is how effective detention is. If individuals know that they're going to be detained until they're actually granted asylum, people with bad asylum claims aren't going to come. That's good for two reasons. One, because it makes it easier for Border Patrol. Two, people who deserve asylum need to be allowed to restart their lives in the United States. A lot of them have family back home who are in danger too. As soon as we give you asylum, you can bring your family to the United States. But when I left the bench in 2015, the median detention time for people, basically the time it took to do their asylum claims, was 36 days. When you contrast that to 846 days or 1,013 days, what it's been in recent years, that's a problem. One of my facilities that I heard cases from was a family facility in Berks County, Berks Shelter in Pennsylvania. And nobody wants to detain families, but it was the most humane situation you can imagine. If I say it looked like a college campus, my college campus didn't look that well. I went to UVA. So, I mean, it's truly, you could do it in a humanitarian manner, do it quickly, get it done. We need more resources. 730 judges isn't enough.
If I may, just very briefly, we heard talk about the CBP app and how you wait at home to do that. Well, really, that's what you should be doing with your application. You should be applying from your home country, and we should be leaving people in their home country or putting them back in their home country pending the outcome of any process, to deter bad actors from coming, but also so that we're in a position to process the people who are playing by the rules and fitting within the boundaries of our laws as opposed to gaming them.
Thank you. You back.
Senator Scott.
So can I ask you, and maybe I don't understand the law well enough, but if somebody comes, let's say they come from a country that they don't want to accept the individual back, but they get into Mexico, and then they come to the United States. Why shouldn't that be Mexico's problem? Why shouldn't we just say, you're the one who let them into your country? I mean, why? Well, I don't get why it's our problem. It's their problem. If you don't want to do it, Senator. I've raised their tariffs until they do it. I mean, they're the ones that open their border, right, to allow them into the United States.
It is, Mexico has long had very permissive entry into Mexico, and they're very happy to shuttle people along to our border. I agree with you 100%. We talk about MPP and agreement of Mexico and so forth, but one of the changes in the universe of illegal immigration to our borders now is how much of the rest of the world other than this hemisphere is showing up there. Well, I think Mexico would start to finally develop some vetting for people coming into Mexico if we dumped everybody back into Mexico. And there are people in this room I'm sure wouldn't like that, and it would be ugly for a period of time. But if people knew they could not get into the United States and they wouldn't be allowed to wait around for the 1,013 days for the hearing that they wouldn't show up for, they won't come in the first place overwhelmingly, which again also allows you to properly treat the people playing by the rules who are also delayed because of all of these backlogs.
So why don't we do it?
I think it's just a question of political will. We want to be cooperative with Mexico.
When they're not cooperative with us.
When they're not cooperative with us. When Donald Trump rattles the tariff sword, as he did in 2019, they need us economically more than we need them. And I would say one of the mistakes people make is to think of Mexico as an ally. Mexico is not an ally to the United States. It is a neighbor, and we want to get along with our neighbors. But not all neighbors are allies. And Mexico operates in many ways that are very inimical to the well-being of the United States and our security and the people who live here. And I think that, frankly, a period of being much tougher, as you described, Senator, will result after you get through that hump and the difficulty that will arise with Mexico because they won't want to be treated that way, that they will adjust. They will adjust. When Mexico wants to be tough with their immigration laws, they are so much faster than we are, and they are so much tougher than we are. It would shock you to see the comparison.
So do you think the cartels should be designated as terrorist organizations?
I actually don't support that because with the current foreign terrorist organization designation statute, that sweeps in a massive proportion of the people in northern Mexico who you wouldn't really want to be targeting. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's because that statute was really drafted to get after cells, not an organized crime entity that has integrated itself into the community and frankly is a de facto government in many parts of Mexico. We do need a new statute to give the president the tools, the Treasury the tools to get after the cartels, both as a matter of kinetic action and when that's appropriate, as you all set the boundaries on that, and to get after their finances, which frankly I think you should be unleashed a great deal more on.
So Trump has said he's going to do all these executive orders to secure the border day one, right? So what does he need besides what he's got the authority to do under the executive orders?
Well, as I mentioned earlier in response to the chairman's comments, I think it is a lot simpler under current authority to secure the border than it is to deal with the rest of the problem. All of the backlogs we were talking about, that takes congressional support and help. The deportation effort that the president has talked about is going to be complicated. It is logistically challenging, and it will take support from the Congress to really accomplish that.
Is it money or laws?
Both. We talked about Flores. That's one you're all familiar with. It's an incredible hurdle to running an orderly immigration system, all from one judge in California, 30 years ago. And you all can fix those things. TVPRA, as Senator Langford mentioned, there are some major holes that weren't known at the time, say TVPRA, Flores created itself, but that really only Congress can fix.
Did you add something?
Yeah, I mean, with respect to TVPRA, I have no doubt that it was passed with the best of intentions. In fact, I knew many of the people who worked on it. But it has truly had the worst results, Senator Scott. Kids are trafficked today because of TVPRA. President Obama asked Congress in, I believe it was June of 2014, to close the loophole. Congress didn't act. Washington Post said that it inadvertently provides incentives to non-Mexican children to come to the United States. When Ken Cuccinelli, Barack Obama, and the Washington Post all agree on something, it's probably time to take action.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did you want to make a comment?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I would point out the Flores Agreement prohibits locking up children for more than 20 days, but it says it prohibits locking them up for more than 20 days in a place that's not a licensed child care facility, like Berks County is, with a very small capacity. We don't do that because it's really expensive. And as far as the TVPRA, we need to find some middle ground. It does create some very perverse incentives. On the other hand, simply dropping unaccompanied children off in Managua or Guatemala City may not be something we want to do willy-nilly either. So we have to find some other way.
Senator Slotkin.
Thank you. Thanks for being here today. I'm new senator. I'm a former CIA officer and Pentagon official. I did 3 tours in Iraq alongside the military, and my specialty is Middle East terrorism and militias. So I feel deeply connected to the mission of protecting the homeland. And I think the thing that I struggle with is we're a nation of immigrants with a broken immigration system. It's literally working for no one. It works for no one, not employers, not our economy. I'm a northern border state, Michigan, so we know what an orderly, organized border looks like, right? We also know what it's like when all our CBP officers and Border Patrol are pulled off of our border to go serve down at the southern border. They know likey, like we do not like that. We like our cold climate. We don't like what's going on down there, right? And if we had the same situation, frankly, that Texas had with all these people coming over, Michiganders would lose their minds, right? So I am, in the House, I did more border legislation than any Michigander in the House, Democrat or Republican, because I feel passionately about it. The thing I feel also passionately about, though, is that no matter which administration is in, if we only do border security and that's it, and not the immigration part, then we're fixing, we're attacking the symptom and not the overall system. We all know that the majority of those asylum seekers who are trying to come over the borders are economic migrants, like many of our grandparents or great-grandparents. They want a job, they want to make money. We'd all in their shoes probably be looking to do the same thing, but our system doesn't work so they can quickly get in and work at our employers who need them, right? In places like Mackinac Island or our farms or whatever in Michigan. So I guess my question, yes or no, is just, are we all in agreement, Democrat and Republican, that we can attack border security? And I'm here for that. but it is not the entire story. We also have to do immigration reform, and that includes action by this body. We are not absolved in this room of responsibility for what's going on at the border. Can I just get a yes or no, starting with Mr. Cuccinelli?
You are not absolved. There is a lot more than the border.
Right.
A lot more than the border. And,
Great.
You all have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Senator, our immigration system is out of line with our leading allies, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia when it comes to who we bring in. You're absolutely correct.
Great.
Yes, there's been no important reform to our immigration system since 1990.
I just think that, and again, I'm coming from the House. I was on the Homeland Committee there for many years. This is the most politicized issue I've ever seen on both sides of the aisle. We all have a shame on our heads for not doing our work in this body, and I include myself in that, right? It's hard, but we have to do it. And I actually hope that for all the tough stuff that Mr. Trump is saying, that it also comes with border and all the other things, right? And our employers are the ones who are gonna be kind of screaming for the rooftops on that. I'm interested in this idea as someone who spent my first half of my career going after terrorist groups on using some of the designations. Understand and I think agree that militarizing and allowing hot pursuit U.S. military active in Mexico without their permission creates a whole new set of issues. But some of our most powerful financial tools on designating a group as a terrorist group comes from when they have any link in the United States, right? If ISIS is working and they've got someone who's sending the money, or they've got some sort of tie to an American citizen, those laws that we implemented after 9/11 allow us to go after that American citizen and attack in a way that's different. So do these cartels, Mr. Cuccinelli, just because you were most recently in, do they have American links that would allow us to be effective if we use those statutes?
They do have extensive American links. I mean, they're criminal networks by which they make money. There's two ways they make money, overwhelmingly, drug trafficking and human trafficking. And in recent years, human trafficking has probably rivaled the money they were making from drug trafficking. And they work with, so we talk about, say, the Sinaloa cartel, CJNG, they in turn work with the MS-13s and the Latin Kings and so forth. There are relationships from Mexico into the gangs that are international gangs that are operating in our communities. And when I was a Virginia AG, the most significant violent crime threat in Virginia was MS-13. And, now we've seen Tren de Aragua sort of rival that in speed and violence. And, but they do have connections that I wouldn't say they're necessarily connecting to American citizens. They're importing their allies through the illegal immigration who are working with gangs. The exception to that is where there is a financing arrangement where people owe the cartels money after they arrive into the United States. And running those to ground, and frankly, banks in Central America participate in executing those transactions.
Yeah, I know my time is up. I would just say I'm super interested in that concept. Again, military force is something a little different, and I'd be real cagey to be quickly authorizing something like that in Mexico. But on the financial stuff, I think it's an area of interest for a lot of us.
And since you're new, we're not going to institute the waterboarding that we often will do on the
I wouldn't try that with her.
Mr. Chairman, if I could add just one more thing very briefly. This is a real issue on the northern border. We think about the southern border. We've seen Tren de Aragua in Colorado, and there are reports that they are, setting up cells in places like Montana. Because, of course, people like drugs in the United States, they shouldn't, they do. People like drugs in Canada, too. And the last thing that we want to see is more organized crime moving through the United States to that point. And that's the only point I want to add.
I'd just like to also interject briefly on this. The question has always been, border security. Well, what about legal, lawful immigration? Can't we do something, And I'm one who's for more lawful immigration. Not everybody in my party is, but I'm one that's for more lawful immigration. But I'm really pretty much for zero illegal immigration. I don't want millions of people coming in, but I'm more than willing to double double the legal amount or increase the legal amount. So I have bills like on the EB visas, employment-based visas, there's 1 through 5, to double the numbers and take off country caps. That's not a particularly radical thing, and I've addressed it with people across the aisle. The complaint I always get is, well, we don't want to do a little bit, we want to do comprehensive. So the word comprehensive has been bandied around for probably a decade. The problem and the big sticking point between one side and the other is that those of us who are open to more lawful immigration, we're really not open to making 18 million people who came here illegally voters. It changes the country and it obscures things. And I think I've not seen this poll done, but if you were actually to poll people here illegally, it's hard to poll people because they don't want to come forward, but poll them. They're here working. Would you accept a work permit if it didn't involve voting? Because you did break the law to get here, but we wouldn't make you go back to Mexico. Some would say that. I wouldn't say that, actually. I'd say you're a law-abiding person, you want to work here, but you don't get to vote. Your kids are going to get to vote, but you don't get to vote. And there'd be some sort of process for that. But that would be the in-between. But most of the time, the debate devolves towards one side wants voting, pretty quick voting, and the other side says, well, we're not going to do that. So that sort of has held up any small or incremental. I've got an H-2A bill, there's H-2Bs, H-1Bs, all these things could be made a little better and even expand the numbers on, which some of us are for, but we never get there. And I think the impasse, at least in my opinion, is over the aspect of quick voting for people who came in illegally. That's just my opinion. Next is Senator Moreno.
Well, thank you for being here. And I may say something that's never probably been said ever in the United States of America, which is I think there's common ground between Ohio and Michigan on this topic. So I thank you for your willingness to help on this.
Gotten over that football game in November, have you?
Can we strike that from the record? Is that possible to do that? When is Michigan playing on Monday? Oh, they're not. All right. So just want to point that out. All righty. we can agree on the lines. So, look, for me, this is a very, very personal conversation because I'm the one person probably here on the panel and testifying that would not literally be here if it wasn't for a legal immigration system to this country. Wasn't born here, was born in Colombia. This country welcomed me and my family. This issue does not have to be difficult. We've made it very, very difficult. And I can tell you, after campaigning 2,000 miles a week to every corner of the state of Ohio, I hear voters, and I'm sure my colleagues do too, say, why can't you fix this? This is not intellectually complicated. It really isn't. So I would start with a simple premise I'd ask the three of you to answer. Should we have an immigration system that benefits the United States of America as the #1 criteria for any legal immigration? Yes or no?
That absolutely should be the priority. Immigration for America is for the benefit of America, first and foremost. It is true that the immigrants benefit, but that is a secondary benefit to the focus of a nation. We have to take care of ourselves first, and we haven't done that for decades.
U.S. citizenship is probably the most precious status in the world, and we should treat it accordingly, and we should use it to the benefit of all the American people.
Absolutely, and I've heard some points of agreement in this room today, which actually surprised me.
Yeah, and I think that's how we can move forward on this. And to Senator Paul's point, I don't think we have to boil the ocean all at once. I think we can agree that, for example, if we're talking about the hyper-specific legal status of asylum, that we can remember what it means. So I'd ask each of you to define to me what it means to be a refugee seeking asylum. What is, for the people who may not be into this topic every single day, what does that mean to be a refugee seeking asylum?
Well, to put it in street terms, it's someone who is, it's easy to use countries as an example. Cuba, who's persecuted for their political views by a communist regime. And I actually think if you think of it in terms of persecution by the government, and only the government, then you can start to simplify this. For example, in the Western Hemisphere, there's probably not a good reason for any other countries other than Venezuela and Cuba to ever have any asylees, period. And so if you can't be an asylee from any of the other countries because it's not the 1980s in Central America or Colombia, for example, any longer, then you can streamline rather dramatically the Western Hemisphere piece of that equation.
And do you to follow up on that, is there a scenario in which there are actual refugees from Mexico? In other words, would you classify Mexico as even in the realm of possibility of having actual refugees, people being persecuted for their race, nationality, or religion from Mexico?
No, and the Mexico is, as noted, the 10th largest country in the world population-wise, and it is the belief of the U.S. government has been for a long time that if an individual who's a Mexican citizen is being persecuted somewhere in Mexico, they can go elsewhere in Mexico, and that is their solution, which is why the caveat of persecution by the government is so important to qualify as an asylee. Refugees can be different. They can be, people who are displaced by war, for example. We are one of the few countries that uses those two terms somewhat differently, asylee and refugee.
So persecution is defined, you're eligible for asylum if you show past persecution or well-founded fear of future persecution on account of your race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. I took Mr. Isacson's line. But it's also important, as Mr. Cuccinelli mentioned, that persecution has to be either inflicted by the government or a group that the government cannot or will not control. When I was a judge, I heard asylum claims from Ireland, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Australia. So yeah, there are definitely safe places in this world, and we probably need to work harder diplomatically to make those places safer so that people can return to them.
There are a lot of asylum claims in the U.S. Immigration Court for Mexican citizens. They do have a relatively low approval rating or grant rate, but it's not zero. Basically, the argument is usually the Mexican government cannot or will not protect them from organized crime or from whoever is discriminating against them.
So would it be reasonable not to allow asylum seekers to cross through a non-designated port of entry? Would that be reasonable, something that we can all agree on?
You mean, would it be reasonable to not accept asylum requests from people not coming through a legal port of entry?
Correct.
That would be eminently reasonable. It's unreasonable not to implement that sort of vetting.
You would agree, Mr. Isacson?
That's the current rule in place right now, and it does hurt some vulnerable people. There still has to be a process.
Okay.
And the best part about it, Senator Moreno, very briefly, when we talked about the money paid to the cartels charge a peso to cross their territory and to help you get across the border illegally. If you come through the port, you take that money out of the cartel's pocket.
One follow-on to Senator Moreno's question. He mentioned having a definition and having it be governmental, and Mr. Cuccinelli, you responded, yeah, you thought maybe just Cuba and Venezuela. Do you think the law permits the president to define asylum that way now and just say Cuba and Venezuela, they'll still have to be vetted, but nobody else is basically eligible because there is no systemic governmental persecution?
I do think the authority, the regulatory authority for the implementation of asylum exists to do that. I would note that the State Department has been historically wildly uncooperative in doing anything of that nature.
Senator Ernst.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. So I'd like to paint a little bit of a picture for everyone. We have already purchased border wall materials. Okay, lots of border wall materials. And they were basically abandoned by the Biden administration. And so they're just sitting in Arizona and other places unused, and they're collecting dust in the desert. But here's kind of the kicker for everyone is that they're not just sitting there. They're actually protected by a fence. So if anybody sees the irony in that, I do, and I actually saw it personally. So yeah, the administration did everything with these materials except actually build a wall. So we're talking about $250 million worth of materials that were purchased. They are paid for, and they could have bolstered our security, but instead we've just left them there to waste. And every month, and this is to add insult to injury, every month the Army Corps of Engineers spends $160,000 to store these materials. 20,822 unused panels. So these materials were eventually auctioned off by the Biden administration, and those that purchased the materials paid pennies on the dollar to buy those items, and that's a huge loss for our taxpayers. So, Mr. Cuccinelli, why don't we start with you, please? Can you talk about the role that physical barriers play in securing our border and the message that it's sending to the cartels and other bad or illicit groups when the federal government just leaves these materials unused, they're rusting away in the desert, and how we should be thinking about border barriers in the future with the incoming Trump administration?
So thank you, Senator, for that question. First of all, the intentional abandonment of the border wall materials was part of the open borders policy and narrative. It was a visual part of that narrative. And unfortunately, it was effective in inviting people from all over the world to come across our border. We saw the numbers in the last 4 years on one of the charts. They exploded, absolutely exploded. And because it isn't just our hemisphere so overwhelmingly any longer, we have massively complicated every aspect of dealing with those illegal immigrants. The border barriers work when the political will is behind those barriers to actually protect immigration law. The barrier itself, however tall you make it, people can get over. And if they get over and know they can stay, you might as well not put it up in the first place. But I will say that putting those barriers up strategically, intelligently, helps keep your Border Patrol agents safer. It helps them manage the illegal flows in ways that are more predictable, and thus they can respond to them better. You get more efficiency in your law enforcement, and you get more safety. And I know that's important to you and everyone on this committee. All of those folks are safer when they have the wall, when they have the road behind the wall, when the lights and the technology are in place that allow detection to take place out at a distance and allow your Border Patrol agents to respond effectively, efficiently, and not in a harried, last minute sort of manner. They're safer and more effective.
Yes, thank you very much. And eons ago, I served as a military engineer, and part of the role of military engineers is to physically shape the battlefield and direct the flow of the enemy. I'm not saying that everyone coming to the border is an enemy, but you understand the illustration there. Yes, Mr. Arthur.
Senator, if I could, one, I'd note the fact that you and 39 of your colleagues sent a letter to the Comptroller General in March of 2021 about this. I disagree with the Comptroller General's opinion about the Impoundment Act. I think it was an impoundment. But the more important part of that is when we talk about the border wall, we talk about the border wall system. It's the wall and the roads and the lights and the fiber optic cable. When you're out in the middle of the desert, when you're far away from civilization, where much of the border is, Border Patrol agents can't just pull out their phone and use the, use cells because there's no cell tower. That fiber optic cable would have enabled them to actually communicate. When President Biden shut down the border wall system, he stopped the cable. The lights sit unhooked up. We literally leave our agents in the dark, blind, because we don't have those things. The quicker we can get that up and running, the better, the safer it's going to be for everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you.
Senator Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our, thank you, Mr. Chair, thank you to witnesses, and thank you for being here. As we examine the first Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy, it's important to remember that there is no substitute, in my opinion, for comprehensive immigration reform as part of that overall strategy, and that Congress has the sole authority and responsibility for making that happen. And we owe it to our border communities and all Americans to fix this system. So, Mr. Isacson, I have a couple questions for you. So, in your testimony, you emphasize that the Remain in Mexico policy enriched cartels by giving them a new large base of migrants to extort and take advantage of, something that I did see in Arizona also. You also mentioned that smugglers looking to profit from illegal border crossings benefited from Remain in Mexico as migrants look to illegal means of entry into the United States. So this organized crime does not stay on the side of the border. We know that for a fact in Arizona. It crosses into our border towns and even further into Tucson, Phoenix, and beyond, and endangers just everyone. Any action that will increase cartel activity is a major concern for me and obviously for U.S. citizens. So what actions could the Trump administration have taken to keep cartels from benefiting from Remain in Mexico? So I'm not saying like he shouldn't have done it, but what I'm saying is obviously it happened, but what could we have done to stop the kind of benefit that they ended up receiving from it, in your opinion?
So if the Trump administration were, in fact, moving people still into Mexico for several months at a time, well, first of all, have the capacity to be able to judge these cases more quickly. Don't make people wait for several months in Mexico. Have enough judges on hand so that they can be there. Invest way more in shelter and protection and really check up on whether the Mexican government was really providing that shelter and protection and keeping the cartels at a distance from these people, which they absolutely were not. But, obviously, I don't favor the program as a whole, but there were ways to actually mitigate that.
Right. So your testimony also discussed the impacts of Remain in Mexico on our bilateral relationship with Mexico. In 2019, President Trump proposed tariffs on Mexican goods until legal immigration through Mexico was remedied. He also floated the idea of high tariffs on Mexican goods in this next administration. According to your testimony, and just from my experience in Arizona, we are a richer state because of border trade. Mexico was a United States top trading partner in 2023 with $800 billion in bilateral trade, $1.5 million per minute. Arizona's port of entries and border communities are major hubs of transnational trade and benefit economically from both. We both benefited from that relationship. How do you anticipate that the United States trade relationship with Mexico would be impacted by the re-implementation of Remain in Mexico?
If Mexico at all proved unwilling to implement Remain in Mexico, or maybe didn't like the list of countries that the Trump administration wanted them to receive, et cetera, you would likely see a tariff threat, right? You would see maybe tariffs implemented. If you had tariffs implemented, if they were high enough, it would be the equivalent of an embargo on Mexico, and that $800 billion would shrink quite a bit. No matter what, at the Mariposa port of entry, right near Nogales, things would be a lot quieter.
Yep. And how would this be different than the effects that we saw under the last administration?
Well, Mexico did agree to the last Remain in Mexico, and ultimately the effects at ports of entry were not great. A lot of the tent courts and the people forced to return were at ports of entry where cargo was not crossing very much. Right. It did, of course, it took some bandwidth away from CBP, who had to handle all of this, but ultimately it wasn't a huge effect on trade.
And there was a discussion about some of the asylum seekers that come from countries where, if we wanted to deport them back, we wouldn't be able to actually deport them back. And part of deterrence is for people to understand you will be deported. There is, you have process of deportation, and why waste your time, money, why pay a coyote or whatever it is for this if there's a high likelihood chance that A, you go before a judge, you're going to be deported, you're going to be rejected. But what about for those countries that we don't have a solution? So those countries that will not accept them back, like the Cubas, the Venezuelas. So what can this incoming administration do to ensure we have somewhere to send these people who are deemed inadmissible?
Well, it's tough because, if somebody's coming from a country that's so badly governed, they very well may have a strong asylum case. These countries are not our friends for a reason, because their governments are really bad. So that's one thing. You have to give them a fair hearing. Two, but
even if we give them a fair hearing and before a judge and with representation, and they say you don't have a good case for asylum, where do we deport them? Because we have to do something, what I'm saying, and because that's the biggest solution. In Arizona, when we see surges, it largely is from these countries where they will not take back their asylum seekers.
Yeah, I mean, there's no great answer for that. You could do a lot of diplomacy to have the burden shared throughout the Americas, and some countries like Colombia are doing a heck of a lot to integrate people, but other countries could be doing more. And that's something like that was being started with the Los Angeles Declaration process in the Biden administration. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, there's no place to put somebody from Venezuela right now.
Right.
And there's 600,000 of them in the past couple of years.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Hassan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you and the ranking member for this hearing. Congress certainly needs to work on a bipartisan basis to improve our border security. And in fact, of course, we had a bipartisan border security deal last year that made major improvements to security at the southern border, including with some important changes to asylum standards. And it also included hiring significant additional law enforcement personnel. It had the support of the National Border Patrol Council, and I strongly supported that deal. And unfortunately, as we all know, President-elect Trump decided to kill that deal for purely political reasons. So I am hopeful that we can move past politics and actually get back to work on the kind of bipartisan deal that I think we are hearing agreement about in this room. And like Senator Slotkin, I am a northern border senator. So I also don't want us to take our eyes off the need for a northern border strategy. And Senator Kramer and I have had bipartisan legislation that this committee actually passed, and I hope we will revisit that as well. Going forward, we need to work together to examine the most effective ways to secure the border and weaken cartels. And part of that is examining the effects of the Remain in Mexico program during President-elect Trump's first term. So, Mr. Isacson, I want to follow up on Senator Gallego's questions a little bit. Your testimony states that the previous Remain in Mexico policy enriched the cartels. I want to repeat that. It enriched the drug cartels that are poisoning our country and create enormous violence. They kidnapped and extorted immigrants waiting in border towns for their court dates. Public reporting showed that ransom payments routinely cost $4,000 to $7,000 per person, and that a single criminal gang in a single border town could steal $35,000 a day from people. So, Mr. Isacson, your testimony notes that in 2019 and 2020, cartels and criminal gangs extorted at least $70 million over the 2 years in this way, in large part fueled by the Remain in Mexico program. If the Remain in Mexico program were reinstated, how would you expect the cartels to attempt to profit from extortion and ransom?
I think the cartels will continue to extort, perhaps at even higher rates because they're more powerful now even than they were then. And they would still have those three income streams, the ransoms, the extortions, and the coyote services.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a very conservative estimate. The money would be more.
Yeah, okay. I also want to just touch on the issue of cooperation with the Mexican government. Law enforcement in the United States works closely with Mexican authorities to interdict drug smuggling, human trafficking, and other crimes committed by the cartels. And by the way, Mr. Arthur, I think it was you who said that we need to continue to work to reduce drug demand in this country. That's something I've heard from the Mexican government, too. The other thing that we have worked on in a bipartisan way on this committee is our southbound weapons and cash to the cartels are a real problem. And we need to, Senator Langford and I have worked together on a bill that would do much more screening southbound to try to stem the flow of cash and weapons to the cartels from this country, which are used as payment for the illicit drugs. But one of the things that we do with the Mexican government is Mexico allows our Homeland Security investigation agents to work with Mexican authorities to target drugs and precursor chemicals that are being shipped from China to Mexico. They're then made into fentanyl, and then they're entering the U.S. Sometimes they're not made into fentanyl down there, and sometimes they're made up here. But how, Mr. Isacson, would reinstating the Remain in Mexico program potentially affect cooperation with Mexico on joint efforts to disrupt drug smuggling?
The question is how we were to go about it. If the administration was, if Mexico was reluctant, the administration decided it was really going to push and bully and publicly humiliate Mexico until they agreed to take these people, Mexico would be much less willing to cooperate on other things like fentanyl.
Yeah, okay. I think it's, I was pleased to hear kind of consensus growing around thinking through what targeted legislation would look like to really treat the cartels as the kind of hybrid organizations they are, using some terrorist techniques, but for organized crime purposes. I think it was really interesting that all three of you seemed to coalesce around some important ideas in that regard. As one of the states that has been particularly hard hit by the fentanyl epidemic, I would be very interested, and I know my colleagues on both sides of the aisle would be too, on working on how we really go after those cartels. We have comprehensive immigration reform to do, to be sure, but that shouldn't stop us from going after some of the most predatory criminal organizations in the history of mankind. Thank you.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for calling this hearing. Mr. Isacson, if I could just start with you. In March of 2024, you wrote, "The murder of a nursing student in Georgia has a lot of people on the right talking about migrant crime like it's an actual issue." That'd be Laken Riley you were talking about?
Laken Riley was an unusual case.
Yeah, here, let's have a look. Here's Laken Riley.
Yes.
Her murder, her horrific murder at the hands of this illegal migrant who was also unlawfully paroled in the United States. Her death, not an actual issue?
It's a tragedy.
But not an actual issue?
Migrant crime is much less of an issue than U.S. citizen committed crime.
Not an actual issue? Those are your words. Her death, not an actual issue. I just want to get, no, you say.
Of course it's an issue. It's a tragedy.
So what do you mean by your post? It's not an actual issue, meaning we shouldn't be paying attention to it. Senate's wasting its time this week on the Laken Riley Act that would address the circumstances of her murder. What's your advice to us? We just discontinue those proceedings now?
I think the Laken Riley Act could do a lot of harm. It would allow me to say, oh, this person shoplifted, and that would be enough probable cause to get somebody deported.
Interesting. You're here. Who invited you to this committee hearing today, Mr. Isacson?
The minority party.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're here as a spokesman for the minority party. I just want to make sure the record's clear on this. The spokesman for the minority party is advising the Senate that the Laken Riley Act is a bad idea and we ought to stop it. The spokesman for the minority party is saying that Laken Riley's death and migrant crime is not an actual issue. I can't frankly believe that I am hearing these words. You said it's not an actual issue. I read you the quote.
Laken Riley's death was not an actual issue.
You said that the murder of a nursing student in Georgia has a lot of people on the right talking about migrant crime. You put it in quotation marks, square quotes, like it's an actual issue. She's dead because of migrant crime, right? Let's try something else. Here, do you know who this is? Do you know who this young man is?
I do not.
Travis Wolf, 12 years old, from my state, murdered by an illegal migrant who was also, like Jose Ibarra, illegally paroled by the last administration.
Is your expectation that zero migrants?
Let me tell you what my expectation is that those who commit crimes in this country will be appropriately dealt with. Absolutely. And that we should not be allowing migrants who commit crimes into this country. And that, yes, migrant crime that kills people like Travis Wolf, whose death was shocking, whose death is inexplicable, indefensible. I actually do think, yes, I think it's an actual, wait a minute, it's my time, Mr. Isacson. I actually think, and I want the record to be clear on this, that migrant crime is a real issue. I think the Laken Riley Act is absolutely necessary. In fact, I propose an amendment to the Laken Riley Act that will cover people like Travis Wolf. I think that ICE ought to be required to detain those illegal migrants who commit violent crimes against children, like Travis Wolf. And yes, I happen to think, as a former prosecutor, I happen to think that their violent murders are actual issues. And the fact that you would say otherwise, sit here and advise the Senate that the Laken Riley Act is a bad idea, that the whole thing is not an actual issue, it's all made up, I think is outrageous. I think it's absolutely outrageous. And the fact that you were invited here to give this testimony is stunning to me, I have to say. Absolutely stunning to me. Mr. Cuccinelli, let me just ask you, something else that Mr. Isacson has said is that the Remain in Mexico policy was a program of death. A program of death. Is that your experience, having seen it implemented? A program of death?
As part of implementing it, my answer would be no. It was quite the opposite. And as I said in my statement, that the deterrent effect for illegal aliens to come that was gained by the migrant protection protocols, Remain in Mexico program, prevented a lot more abuse, child abuse, abuse of women on the journey, and death along the way than any of the crimes that occurred addressed to the people where the people in Remain in Mexico were the victims. So anytime we have illegal immigration going on, we have victimization of that population. It would be my view, and I think the dollars play it out, especially as you've seen since 2019, that the idea that the cartels benefited from the Remain in Mexico program is relatively ludicrous compared to the alternative. And the alternative we've lived with the last 4 years has been the greatest enriching of the most evil, vicious people in the Western Hemisphere in the history of this hemisphere.
Yeah, I wish the Remain in Mexico program had still been in effect. When the killer of Travis Wolf crossed the border and was paroled illegally into the country, he might still be alive today. And if that's not an actual issue, I don't know what is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You know, I think we've had a good discussion on the issue, and I think it's an important issue, and I think we have to have these discussions. You know, both sides have to be heard, and we got to figure out how to move forward. The one sort of dispute we have, you know, like in a court of law, you got the facts and you hear both sides, and someone says this is a fact, someone says this fact is, and I think there is something here that is in contention, and that is whether or not the Remain in Mexico policy enriched the cartels. And this chart is kind of similar to not as famous as Senator Johnson's chart, but similar in the sense that you can see sort of Remain in Mexico, the encounters come down to about 20,000 or so. Here they're up around 300,000. So you've got essentially a tenfold increase. And so if we say, and we understand that cartels make money by getting people across the border, it seems hard to me to argue that when you have 300,000 encounters that they wouldn't make more money here than they make here. I just find it really hard. And so I'd like to give each of you a chance to respond to that. Why don't we start with Ken Cuccinelli?
So, Mr. Chairman, you're right. And the CBP intel assessments, you know, we don't audit the cartels, right? But the intel folks who track what they do as best we can believe that they're financing the money they were making on human trafficking probably past drug trafficking in the Biden administration. So the chart here serves as a proxy to money they were making from this
If we wanted to know more for certain, and it's an estimate because it's all done illegally, is there someone who makes an estimate of this, somebody in our intel who is looking at this that would be able to, we could bring here?
Intel shop is your best.
You think they make an estimate month by month on what they think they're making? So it's still going to be an estimate, but if we wanted further information on it, we could ask the CBP.
Correct.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Arthur?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Senator. And it's not just the cartels, it's also the smuggling organizations. It's always important to keep the two separate. Smugglers actually do the heavy lifting. The cartels then skim the cream off of the top to let those individuals cross what they call their territories. And then you've also got the human traffickers that can feed in that environment as well. So when you're talking about the money that's flowed into the pockets of the cartels, right there. But it's not just simply from taking fees or shaking down migrants. When you send large numbers of people across the border, you create what Chief Rodney Scott, who's the CBP designee, commissioner designee, called controllable corridors. So you send a bunch of kids and adults over, Border Patrol rushes over to get them, and then it creates a void in the line that the cartels can use to run the drugs to the United States. Absolutely crucial part of this. They're feasting right now.
So you would agree that the argument that when there are more encounters and more traffic going across, it would be proportional to more profits.
Absolutely.
Not the reverse. So when you have
Absolutely.
Remain in Mexico down here, it's a little hard to argue they're making more money when there's a lot less people going across the border as opposed to here.
Absolutely, and there's also a lot less human carnage, Senator, because Ken had talked about this, but Doctors Without Borders did a report in 2017 in which they estimated that about 68+% of all migrants are physically abused during that illegal journey to the United States. Just under a third of all women are sexually abused. When you cut down the number of people coming, you cut down the number of crimes.
Thank you. Mr. Isacson.
On that chart, I would point out that that low point there was the beginning of COVID, and just before that, Remain in Mexico was almost done. Between then and when it was actually terminated, you had about 4,000 or 5,000 people put in that program over all of those months, so it was hardly in existence.
Say a little bit louder, please.
Sure. Remain in Mexico was hardly in existence from the time that COVID began until it was actually terminated when Joe Biden was inaugurated. Maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people put in the program in that entire space. So it was not much of a deterrent at that point. Title 42 had really been what was on people's minds if they were thinking of crossing the border.
Basically, you're making the argument that quite a bit of the dip is COVID. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, at the bottom there, it's COVID and Title 42, yeah.
Senator, I'll note the fact that the pandemic wasn't declared until March the 20th, 2020. You can see the bottom of your chart there.
Right.
And one of the things that opponents of Title 42 would say is that, you know, the numbers were inflated because of recidivism. So I would gently disagree with Mr. Isacson. I'd say that when you look at that right there, you get people stopped under 42, they get turned back, and then they just come around because there is no deterrent effect. There's no punishment for re-entering under Title 42. There is one with MPP.
So if, you know, the Trump administration saying they want to correct some of the problem of all the people who've been paroled and millions of people are here, one of the big complaints is that their hearing won't come up for 1,000 days or whatever, 3 or 4 years. Does the president have the power, if he wished to simply say all the hearings are going to be in 1 month and designate enough people to hear these? I mean, could there be, if you basically came up with a rule and said Cuba's eligible and Venezuela's eligible, nobody else is eligible, and the proceeding will now be that you show up and someone's going to ask you where you're from, and if you can prove you're from Cuba or Venezuela, you're going to get a hearing. If you don't, your hearing's over and concluded, and there's a much speeding up of the process. We'll start with Mr. Cinelli. Do you think that power exists? Would that be something you'd recommend?
It's a good question. It's probably a close question about whether that power exists. It would certainly be litigated, of course, because everything will be litigated. But I believe there is already existing a lot more authority by the president to not consider asylum petitions from various countries. And whether that's, excuse me, by the third country regulation being reinstated. So if you pass through Mexico and you don't apply for asylum there, you don't get to apply for asylum here. That was extremely effective, but it was lost in the wash statistically of COVID. We do have, you know, we're looking at one program, but there were other programs, for example, expedited removal was also used more heavily starting in 2019. So it's hard sometimes to disentangle the data. I think the DHS report about the success of MPP is your best conclusive source of information for how that was successful and the fact that it was very successful in keeping people out and deterring others.
On the same lines, Mr. Arthur, if the definitional change can be controlled by the president, would this help with the expediting of all these cases instead of 1,000 days going back to the 36 days you talked about? If we just make the job easier, that we don't have to go, and I frankly think most of these people by definition should be ineligible for the process. And that's what we should do moving forward. But even looking backwards, we tell people your detention hearing's next month, and you're supposed to go back to where you were brought in, where you came in illegally. If that's in Texas, you're supposed to go back. It would be a directive for people, at least those who are going to voluntarily do as they're told, to go back. And it would also be a law that if they break that law and you tell them they got to be there in 2 months and they're not there, I would think then you have grounds for no hearing. They've broken a law that is the law. Now they're would be immediately deported wherever they are. But what do you think about the president's power to have a definitional change, and whether or not that we could expedite or move their dates up on detention hearings?
Sure, absolutely. The first thing it's important to note, many of you may not be aware of this, the law already says asylum claims are supposed to be heard from beginning to end in 180 days. So they've just ignored Congress's admonition with respect to that.
Say that again, between 2 and 180?
No, within 180 days, from beginning to end, 180 days.
Okay.
But the other part of that is that the way that the asylum statute is written, it has two parts. One, anybody can apply. And then there's a separate section for who can be granted. So the potential argument is, yes, the president can say anybody can apply, but only these people can be granted. Now it's going to get litigated. It was litigated the last time, never got up to the Supreme Court. President used his 212F powers to prevent people from applying for asylum. Mr. Cinelli knows all about that. But it got to the Ninth Circuit. It was stopped at the Ninth Circuit. And respectfully, toward the judges, it was an awful decision. It was just poorly reasoned. Had it gone to the Supreme Court, I think it would have gotten overturned. Basically, though, that's what the Biden administration is doing right now. Mr. Isacson has referred to that. We're not allowing those individuals to apply for asylum with exceptions. But they came too late to that conclusion.
Mr. Isacson?
Well, I mean, sure, if you wanted to get you got 1.5 million or more asylum cases pending. That's a matter of appropriations. So you have to have the capacity. You have to have people, no matter what you're doing. Now, banning certain countries, I personally don't think the statute backs that up. 212F appears to be usable to block someone from coming to the United States, but once they're here asking for protection, that's a different case. So I think this would be litigated to death if you were to try that.
I think the hearing has been useful and very informative. Thank you all for coming. We're going to vote here in just a couple of minutes. Before we adjourn, if anybody's got a pressing question, we'll start with Senator Peters. Anything else? Anybody else on this side?
Yeah,
Senator Reno.
Yeah. If I could just add, maybe a recap of what we agree on would be worthwhile. I think there's broad consensus that you should only be able to claim asylum at a legal port of entry, and that you should be barred from claiming asylum at a legal port of entry if you haven't made that application in Mexico. Would you agree with that, Mr.
Absolutely. And in terms of incoming flow, it would do an awful lot to throttle the numbers, most particularly targeting really baseless cases. And I should note, since this is an MPP-focused hearing, when you look at the asylum claims that came out of MPP, they were granted at something like a 10th or less of the rate of just the average asylum caseload. And those are decided by the exact same case officers and judges as decide all the other cases. So MPP successfully screened out an awful lot of fraudulent asylum seekers, and the numbers bear that out.
Senator, I note the fact that every country in the Western Hemisphere, except for Cuba, an island, and Guyana, a enclave on the coast, grants some sort of asylum. If you need protection, you can go to any of those countries. People cross through 7, 8, 10, 20 countries to come here. Colombia, your home country, grants asylum. You can go there. You don't have to come here. You don't have to take the risk and risk your children.
And many do. You got 20 million people in migration around the whole region, and they're not all coming here. But your question, I mean, should people be able to just come to a port of entry instead, and that be the only way? Yes, I think we would need a lot more capacity than we have right now at ports of entry, so you don't have people in Mexico, anywhere in Mexico for so many months. And you would have to have some exception for the most vulnerable, the people with the most provably urgent cases. I will die if I stay here.
But that's not going to be the situation if they're in Mexico, because we've just discussed the fact that Mexico is a safe country in which you can go to a different part of Mexico. And they've also somehow made it to Mexico, which in and of itself is a pretty incredible accomplishment for somebody who's in that kind of grave danger. You've traversed 9 countries to make it to the northern border of Mexico. You aren't necessarily somebody who's that boy. So I think we got broad consensus there. One last thing, Chairman, you can indulge me, is we can also agree that Congress should not be absolved. I think you said it, Mr. Cinelli. So what's preventing Congress from just passing laws so that we don't need to have executive orders to solve our immigration problem?
Well, That's a
We're going to have
tougher
a conversation
question.
after
Yeah, you want me,
this.
you want me to
I'll tell
answer
you.
that one? Or yeah.
Freshman question.
So I would just note that, you know, when I was the acting deputy secretary, many of your colleagues would call me on the annual H-2B, for example. And I'd get pitched and pitched and pitched because you all would give the secretary the authority to raise that number 1 year at a time. And every single senator, I said the same thing. This is your job. This is your job. This isn't my job. You're supposed to tell us the number. I know, but we just can't manage it. Every single senator, and I talked to maybe a half dozen, all conceded that, you know, the process wasn't working for the Congress to be legislating on those things. And you've noted, you know, areas of agreement. Looking back 20 years, one of them is literally the physical ports of entry. Mr. Isacson mentioned capacity. There's also the question of physical capacity at the ports of entry that I think you can probably achieve bipartisan agreement on updating and upgrading those. You do need to do that. And if you're going to do the southbound, I'll call it inspections, you must expand your ports of entry. And if you do that southbound type of investigation that Senator Hassan was talking about, you take Mexico's biggest excuse off the table. That is their biggest national government excuse, and by that I mean for the U.S. government. But that's something that needs to happen, and to use things like the non-intrusive technology for doing those searches at the border can happen a lot faster, but it's going to take upgrading those facilities. They're long overdue for it.
Senator Langford.
Yeah, no, we're wrapping this up, but thanks, y'all, for the testimony and the work and the research that you've all done on it. What I did here is common ground is Congress needs to relook at the TVPRA and say, we've got to be able to figure this out. Right now, if a child comes from Mexico, we return them back to their parents in Mexico. If a child comes from Guatemala, even if they've got a parent in Guatemala, we keep them here. And that just makes no sense. And I've heard over and over again from governments in Central America saying to me point blank, give us our children back. Why does the United States keep our children? We've got to be able to figure that part out, and that shouldn't be hard for us. And the other one I've heard is the designated terror organization trying to be able to figure out how do we actually get this resolved, that we can put more financial pressure on these cartels on it. So thanks again for the testimony.
I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us here today for their testimony and expertise. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 6 p.m. on Thursday, January 23rd, for the submission of statements and questions for the record. The hearing is now adjourned. We will meet again in about 2 minutes to begin our markup on voting. Pursuant to the notice on January 9th, 2025, the committee will consider two items today: the rules package for the committee for the 119th Congress and a resolution on Remain in Mexico. I note the presence of a quorum. The committee will proceed to consideration of the updated rules of the procedure of the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs. That's been distributed, and all right, I will say something just briefly with regard to this, and then we'll call on Senator Peters to say briefly, or anybody that wants to make a comment. I think that over the past 150 years, really Woodrow Wilson on, FDR on, the government, the executive branch has gotten bigger and bigger. The administrative state has gotten bigger and bigger. Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers that the checks and balances would be not Republican against Democrat, but branch against branch, that we would vie and pit ambition against ambition, but it would be the ambition for the legislature as a whole to maintain power and the executive branch to take the power, and back and forth, and we would be the check by watching them. They've gotten arrogant, all of them, and I don't mean this as a Republican-Democrat thing. All executive branches are arrogant and try to hide the ball on everything, and so I simply want to work very hard as an oversight committee to make sure we're watching them. This will include a new administration of my party, and I pledge to the minority party, the opposition party, that I'm very open, and I've always told Senator Peters, very open to records requests from the minority as well. And so I picture this as the legislature doing its duty, but not anything to do with party. Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Chairman Paul. Today, we're going to be discussing two items, committee's new rules and the resolution. And I just want to start off by saying, and for those of us who have been on this committee in the past and are welcoming our new members to the committee, that this committee has always had a reputation of working in a bipartisan fashion, especially when it comes to approving our rules. For the past 8 Congresses, the committee has unanimously approved the rules. We've come together, and when you set rules that pass unanimously, that leads to the kind of bipartisan collegiality that we expect in this committee. So I will say I'm disappointed that we've made some changes to these rules. I've been working with Chairman Paul on a number of those items, and certainly some accommodations were made, particularly for our subcommittee. So I appreciate the chairman's willing to negotiate that and to make changes on the original proposal that he has. And I'll just say, you know, when you think about a bipartisan way when it comes to investigations, because you're right, it is about standing up to the administration, regardless of who it is, because it is about us versus them, and we talked about that yesterday in the hearing as well. But we did great bipartisan work, went from investigating the failures of the Hurricane Katrina response, the January 6 failures. We dealt with those here in a bipartisan way, and most recently on the attempted assassination attempt of President-elect Trump. Worked together, and that was about collecting documents, getting the information we needed in order to interview witnesses, et cetera. So one of those minority rights is that the minority gets to be consulted. We will get notice, and you've extended the notice by an extra day, so I appreciate that. But it still does not allow us to say at some point, and this is rarely ever used, but it's still a minority power, that at some point you could need a vote of the committee. And actually, when you're asking for subpoenas and you're getting information, a vote for the committee often strengthens that subpoena because it shows there's broad bipartisan support to get the documents from either administration. So that has been weakened. So I'm concerned about that, not happy about it, but I'm also taking the assurances from the chair that the chair will work with the minority side to make sure that if we have requests, if there are things that we would like to get from agencies so that we can do investigative work, that you will fully cooperate with that and will be supportive. And certainly I've been encouraged by the work that we've done over the last few months where we have worked collaboratively. So I'm going to support these rules. Hope we can pass them unanimously, as has been the process over many Congresses. But that's Also going to be an agreement between the chair and the ranking member that we will continue to work in a collaborative way and understand that we have to reassert our authority as Congress to make sure that we're getting the information we need to provide the oversight that we are constitutionally granted.
Without question. And the other thing that I want to do, and we're going to get done, is that any information that is gathered from the executive branch, we're going to have a way that you can log on to it. We're going to put it on a server. You don't have to come and ask me to print it out or anything. We're going to put it all up on the server. It's government records, everybody, Republican and Democrat. We're going to have some kind of sign-in mechanism, but you or your staff in your office is going to be able to log on to this, where there's going to be easier access to things that are accumulated. Now, will there be some exceptions that have to be more careful with? Of course, and we'll figure those out as we go. But in general, government records shouldn't be secret from you, and they shouldn't be secret from the public as well. But I appreciate the cooperation. Did you have anything else to say?
No, I'm good.
Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Hearing none, the question is on the adoption of the updated rules of the procedure on the Committee of Homeland Security and Governmental Rules and Affairs as distributed yesterday evening. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The ayes have it, and the rules will be reported. On the second issue, this is the I've been told to skip remarks because some important people need to leave. So I'm going to skip my remarks, but basically it's about Remain in Mexico. Do we think the president has power under current law to do a lot of the things by executive order that he did his previous administration? That's it in general. Senator Peters?
Well, I would like to offer an amendment to speed things up. I would like to offer amendment number 2 to this resolution.
Agreed.
So Amendment 2 deals with concerns that I think were raised in our hearing here today, and I think broad concerns that we have generally with these policies. I think we all agree there's mutual agreement. We have to have strong borders. We have to enforce the borders. We have to use whatever tools are available in order to do that. And I think it was a productive hearing that we had today. But I also think what came out of the hearing is that this is obviously a very complex situation. We have to be looking at it in a very comprehensive way as to how are we effectively protecting the border, and what are some of the consequences of policies that are put in place as to whether or not they actually are protecting the border and advancing what we want to see. And that's what this amendment addresses, is that before we move forward, certainly we support the president doing everything he can to strengthen the border, but we also ask, and I'll just read here, we also urge the president to certify to Congress that any action that's taken by the administration involving immigration and border management, including the reinstatement of the migrant protection protocols, commonly known as Remain in Mexico, that we discussed this morning, will not. So these are things that, as we're strengthening the border, we hope that they will not do these things. They will not, if Remain in Mexico policy is put back in place, it will not lead to the rape, murder, or kidnapping of asylum seekers while they are waiting for their asylum hearing. 2, it will not contribute to human trafficking, either domestically or internationally. And 3, it will not contribute to violence from cartels and transnational criminal organizations or enable such organizations to actually profit from the exploitation of asylum seekers. It will not increase the smuggling of fentanyl into the United States. It will not result in the separation of families, and it will not undermine protections currently in place to care for the treatment of children. So I certainly hope my colleagues would agree that as we're doing all that this resolution does, and that we will do this. And, remember that, having this resolution is also a departure for this committee. This committee is always about actually dealing with tangible legislation that actually addresses problems. This is a resolution. This is messaging. This is something that may make people feel good, but it doesn't actually deal with the problems that we have at hand. And I hope that in the future, committee time is spent on actual solutions to problems and ways that we can address a very serious issue that we have in this country. But I think this is a statement about who we are as well. We want to be tough on the border, but we also want to make sure there are not unintended consequences from any of these policies.
Senator Johnson.
And Mr. Chairman, just very quickly, reinstituting Remain in Mexico will absolutely guarantee that rapes will decline, that human trafficking will decline, that violence from cartels will decline, that smuggling of fentanyl will decline. I mean, you're going from, at the bottom of President Trump's secure border of about 500 encounters per day to, I think the largest was 14,000 a day. That's what's driving the rapes and the human trafficking, the sex trafficking, and all the smuggling. So this resolution is completely unneeded, unnecessary, and I'm going to vote no.
And
the resolution is unnecessary? Well,
no,
that's
the amendment to the resolution.
Well,
sorry.
If you believe that all this will happen, I appreciate that we will not do this. I'd appreciate your support on an amendment that basically says, I'd like your vote to actually stand behind those statements, not just you making statements without a vote.
So very quickly on this, the reason I'll vote no on this is I agree with the sentiment. I agree with what Senator Johnson is saying. The problem is we're in a very dangerous situation where people are coming up and people are being raped and murdered with or without Remain in Mexico. Some of that's still going to go on. There's not a practical way we can say we're going to vote for something like Remain in Mexico will make the numbers less, but there's no way we can guarantee that there will be no rape and murder, because rape and murder it's a lawless place. The cartels control the 6th of Mexico. So I think it's well-intentioned, but I can't vote for something that we couldn't provably say that we will eliminate all violence in northern Mexico. So I don't think it's a practical way. I will vote no, and I will. Any other quick comment, anybody? We're going to call the roll, but I'd request that you call Senator Scott first and out of order because he's chairing a hearing, if that's okay. We okay with that?
Senator Scott.
Thank you all for the opportunity to say no.
Senator Johnson.
No.
Senator Langford.
No.
Senator Scott of Florida.
No.
Senator Hawley.
No.
Senator Moreno.
No.
Senator Ernst. Senator Peters.
Doesn't get him out of quick.
Aye.
Because we still have one more.
Senator Hassan.
Aye. One
Senator Blumenthal. Senator Fetterman.
Aye by proxy.
Senator Kim. Senator Gallego. Senator Slotkin. Senator Paul.
No.
Mr. Chairman, on the vote of those present, the yeas are 6, the nays are 8. On the vote by proxy, the yeas are 1, the nays are 0. On this vote, the yeas are 7, the nays are 8, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Okay. Senator Hassan?
Thank you, and I realize our time constraints. I just want to be clear that the testimony this morning was unanimous, that Remain in Mexico results in enriching the cartels that are poisoning our country. I know there are differences on the rest of it, but that is why one of the reasons I will not be voting for it.
We'll call the roll on the passage of the resolution. If you'll start with Senator Scott again, please.
Senator Scott.
Well, aye.
Senator Johnson.
Aye.
Senator Langford. Aye. Senator Scott.
Aye.
Senator Hawley.
Aye.
Senator Moreno.
Aye.
Senator Ernst. Senator Peters.
No.
Senator Hassan.
No.
Senator Blumenthal.
No.
Senator Fetterman.
No by proxy.
Senator Kim.
No.
Senator Gallego.
No.
Senator Slotkin. Senator Paul.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, on the vote of those present, the yeas are 8, the nays are 6. On the vote by proxy, and for the record only, the yeas are 0 and the nays are 1. In this vote, the yeas are 8, the nays are 6, and the motion is agreed to.
Thanks, and we are adjourned.